Hello YouTube, Internet, World. Welcome back to another episode of Dime Store Cinema on the road. Let's talk movies. Today I would like to briefly discuss the silent film The Phantom of the Opera, starring Lon Chaney. Lon Chaney, for those of you who don't know, is considered the father of modern makeup and prosthetic effects. He was a slave to his art, almost. The things that he would do to himself to achieve a look that he was going for, a lot of times ended up hurting him physically. This is particularly true in the film that he did, Hunchback of Notre Dame. He wore a prosthetic shoulder to give them the appearance of being a hunchback. They weighed, it was close to 80 pounds, and ended up hurting his back for pretty much the rest of his life. That's the kind of dedication that he had to his craft. He was more interested in how something looked, if it looked right, if it felt right. That's what he would do. So a lot of times he was very uncomfortable, and obviously the technology back then was just being developed, really, and so it was always kind of trial and error. And I think what really made him stand out above the other people who were testing out the waters, so as it were, was the fact that his acting in general was very physical. So his acting itself always added something to his prosthetics. So it wasn't just relying on the looks alone. It also, his mannerisms, his body language, and particularly how he used his hands. And interestingly enough, The Phantom of the Opera was the first of his films that I had seen. I saw it when I was pretty young, early high school, I believe. And just his use of his hands in this movie made me interested in acting for the brief time that I was interested in being an actor. That desire was only something that I thought about for a few years of my life. Being behind the scenes is always more appealing to me than being in the spotlight. So, but there were those few years that I was interested in it, and the reason I was interested in it was something as simple as this silent film era's actor and his hand gestures. So, The Phantom of the Opera, you might find it somewhat strange that they would have a silent version of it, since it's most well known for the Broadway musical. But the story existed before the musical, obviously, and so this is a retelling of the story without the music, and obviously they had accompaniment when they would show the movie at the time for the theater. However, obviously the music would have been different than what we associate with the story now. In any case, it's that story. It's about an opera singer, and the Phantom of the Opera, as his title is, kind of manipulates the scenes to get this lady a position as the head singer. And then, of course, it's the classic monster movie of the time, where you have a mob with torches and pitchforks chasing him down, and so on and so forth. So you know the story. More than likely, most of you know the story. It's a very, very classic monster story. And what really sets this one apart, and it's a silent film. I understand that's not everyone's cup of tea. I'm not going to apologize for it. I love silent films, and just watching the foundational steps of cinema is fascinating to me. It's the same reason why I'm fascinated with history, finding out where we've been to help us shape where we can go. And it's the same with movies. It's why I advocate watching movies like Birth of a Nation, the original silent film. Despite being racist and awful, its use of cinematography is something so fundamentally important for studying film. So, just like you can study the war tactics of your enemies to become better, it's the same with cinema. You don't have to agree with the message, and you can abhor the message of the film, but the execution can be something that you can learn from. And so once again, going back to this movie, I think there's a lot that can be learned, particularly in the horror industry, from this movie, along with other films that I watched around the same time, like Nosferatu, which I think is a big influence on a lot of people, more so than Phantom of the Opera. But I would say that Phantom of the Opera is probably a better constructed narrative. Nosferatu is creepier. I think they got atmosphere better in that one. Once again, a good building block for portraying a good atmosphere. It's very good in Nosferatu, but I think story structure is stronger in Phantom of the Opera, and also Lon Chaney's performance is, like all of his performance, absolutely brilliant. And so, like I said, I think that it's important to study the history of films, and I think this is a good one for people to study, particularly if they're getting into the horror industry or are interested in horror films in general. The reveal of his deformed face was great, and by today's standard, not particularly how we do things, but at the time they did this great little thing of building tension, where it's slowly, and you see it in movies today, so it had its impact, and it's been something that people have used to build tension as long as tension has been a desired effect in movies. You have the over-exaggerated slow movement to reveal something, and the scene in which this is particularly apparent is the scene where his face is revealed for the first time. The lady is very slowly moving towards him, and he swings around and his face is revealed, and it's this great reveal, and the makeup is once again, by today's standards, a little archaic, but I loved it. And I mean, as a kid seeing it for the first time, I loved it. And even as an adult watching it now, it still fascinates me. Like, coming up with that idea, just from scratch. Like, how am I going to make this person look? How am I going to dress this person up? How am I going to manipulate this appearance to create this sympathetic monster? And once again, I go back to Lon Chaney, and I love his work so much. I love how clever he was. I love how many ideas he had, and how dedicated he was to his art. And I even love his son's work. His son, Lon Chaney Jr., is the Wolfman in the classic in the classic horror film The Wolfman. So a whole family of brilliant actors, and having a very tight bond with the horror industry. And two of the most important names in horror cinema, both being in the same family. And I mean, you have Lon Chaney Jr. being in one of maybe like 4 or 5 decent werewolf movies. Like, almost no one can make a good one. They're really hard to make. They barely exist. And then, of course, you have Lon Chaney, who is, like I said, the grandfather even of modern prosthetic and practical effects. So it's just a powerhouse family of horror, despite the dysfunction in the family. And you can get in the history of that. There was a lot of drinking and just horrible treatment of one another, and hard feelings, a lot of lore even behind the two of them, that a lot of stories that may or may not have been true. But I digress. Yeah, I don't really want to go too much more into it. I just wanted to talk briefly about these movies, particularly about the Phantom of the Opera. It's actually fairly easy to find as far as silent films go these days. So I advocate for it. I suggest you see it. It's definitely worth the time and money. Really enjoyable film to watch. Very entertaining. Once again, watching Lon Chaney do his thing is great. And like I said, the fact that his body acting is so good that even his hand movements convinced me that I wanted to be an actor for a brief time. And I've heard, and I don't know if it's true, that the reason he had so much control over his hands and his ability to act so well with his hands was because I believe it was his parents or someone that he was related to was deaf, so he used sign language to communicate. So I don't know if that's true. It's one of those, once again, stories that surround his name and his family's name. But regardless, as someone who never knows what to do with his hands, particularly in an acting or stage persona, seeing someone who's so in control of it, I think, is what really was intriguing to me. You're always attracted to those things that you can't do, because, or at least for me, because it fascinates me and I want to learn how to do something as well as that person. So that's always the desire. It's like, if I don't know how to do something and I really want to, I watch the people who are good at it, and it fascinates me. And that was the case with Lon Chaney. And so, once again, Phantom of the Opera, starring Lon Chaney. I could not recommend this more highly. I think it's a great film, particularly if you're interested in studying film history, but even more so if you're interested in horror films, if you want to see the progression of horror films through the years. Maybe start with Nosferatu and then go to Phantom of the Opera, and then work your way up from there. I think it's a great building block for learning about film history and the trajectory of the horror industry, and even just cinema in general. But anyway, that's my video. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, please subscribe if you're into that kind of thing, and I will see you all next time.